Hi, this is a synopsis of the IC lecture for Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. Many of you were not able to make it, although I was very pleased to see quite a few of you there. Those of you who were there can use this lecture or this YouTube presentation as a review. Uh, those who could not make it know that you will not be penalized, and that in fact this YouTube presentation is a way to get the basic points, the fundamental aspects of what we talked about. That said, you will need to get some notes from fellow students, and you certainly will need to read carefully the passages in Stockstead on early Africa. In great outline, what we're talking about here, of course, is the rise of civilization in Western Africa, centering on, but not limited to, the modern country of Nigeria. Today, this is where a lot of the most important developments in African cultural history and economic history and political history take place. Now, of course, we are setting aside Egypt because we're talking now about sub-Saharan Africa and Egypt, although it is extremely important for Eastern Africa from a very early time, from 2000 BC at least. This is not going to be concerning us because there's no real impact to this development that we're going to talk about today. So the rise of civilization is the same sort of story that we talked about with India, but it's not going to follow exactly the same trajectory. But it does begin with Nok, N-O-K. And by 500 BC or so, a very interesting ceramic tradition uh, springs out of the northern portion of this area. We know very little about the society. We know very little about the culture except for these amazing ceramic sculptures. These are less than life size, and as I stressed in class, they are marked by two fundamental characteristics. One is that the poses are often pensive or still. There's a certain balance, a sort of almost meditative state that these figures seem to be engaged in. And the other is that the head is enlarged. Now, current scholarly opinion tends towards the idea that these represent not particular people so much as ideals that are embodied in particular great people, and the ideals would uh, revolve around this idea of wisdom, of right thinking. The enlarged head in later African cultures indicates wisdom for many, and the idea of the meditative posture here, although this is a little more of a stretch, may be in fact also part of this sculptural communication. Now, there are all sorts of Nok ceramic sculptures. Many of them are in pieces. A lot of heads have been found. But in general, there is a great centering, a great focus on the head, and there are these still postures. And so I tend to agree that for the moment, that interpretation seems to be the most productive one. Now, we have found no huge Nok city. In fact, it's very probable that what we're talking about is the rise of a particular kind of leader who is immortalized in these sculptures, a leader that is seen to be wise and just in larger villages, perhaps, as agriculture and metalworking begin to make their presence felt, or in fact are in the case of metalworking, are independently invented in this area of Africa. But in the center of Ife, I-F-E, uh, we see the move towards a more complex civilization that is going to become a urban civilization, a civilization based in the cities, and the cities themselves organized around a palace or court system. And in this art, we have, and this is of course much later than Noak. We're talking about 800 to 1000 AD are the big movements here. But in the move towards a more complex and a more hierarchical urban civilization, we get a much more naturalistic art, an art that is not as interested in the ideal of wisdom. There's much more of an emphasis on a particular individual, a particular character, but these characters are always idealized. We talked a lot about that in class, and we'll talk about that further in the course on African art. But for now, what you need to think about is the fact that these figures are never shown as old, as infirm, as imperfect. They are communicating, and I think that's fairly easy to see through the gorgeousness of this particular work that we're looking at here, that in fact they are all about a particular youthful ideal of beauty. Now, interestingly, one thinks that, or a lot of scholars think that these were set up in shrines uh, after the death of the ancestor. This is certainly true later. Behavior with these busts. These were set up in shrines that immortalized or that were places of contact with particular ancestors. But rather than showing them as they were in old age before they died or in any other point in their lives, there tends to be this desire to show them as an idealized youth. We're going to talk about all these issues later when we get to the great outgrowth of Ife, which is the courtly society of Benin, Benin, in which we're going to see these same propensities towards idealization, towards setting up shrines for ancestors with idealized portraiture, and a real focus on the perfection of the elite, the imagery of this nobility that lives in the court, which in turn functions as the center of this urban civilization.